Eurydice Jane Dixon was born on November 10, 1995. She was known for her courage, determination, and intelligence, as well as her kindness and deep passion for the arts. Life, however, had not always been kind to her. When she was just 7 years old, tragedy struck. Her mother, who had struggled with a heroin addiction, passed away in a shopping center due to an overdose. Eurydice was close to her siblings, her brother Christopher and sister Polly, as well as her father, Jeremy. Described as a natural performer, she quickly began building a career in stand-up comedy, establishing herself as a distinctive and strong voice in the comedy world. Although she was typically introverted, she began to grow, coming out of her shell and channeling her intellect and ideas into her comedy, often drawing on her personal experiences. A staunch feminist, Eurydice was able to make fun of herself and her beliefs, with social issues frequently influencing her routines. She was incredibly supportive of other comedians, with one peer calling her the comic's best friend. No matter what, she always found humor, even when a joke didn't land. Performing regularly at comedy clubs, she quickly made a name for herself in Melbourne's lively comedy scene. On Tuesday, June 12, 2018, Eurydice performed a set at the Highlander Bar, a venue she frequented, testing out some of her new material. Her sets were a success, and she was described as feeling on top of the world due to the positive reception. After she finished, she left the club and walked with her boyfriend, Tony, to see him onto his tram before she began her walk home. It was a walk she often did. As she came to Prince's Park, she took her shoes off and walked barefoot from west to east. She loved the park and did this every time she walked through it. She was just a few 100 meters from her home when she sent her boyfriend Tony a message at 12:02 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, 13th. Said, "I'm almost home safe. How about you?" She walked across 2 of the football pitches and then on to the 3rd, almost back at the house that she shared with her brother and father. At 2:40 a.m., a passerby on his way home from work would make a terrible discovery. On a field at Prince's Park Sporting Precinct, a body was found. He immediately called the emergency services and began CPR. The ambulance was quickly dispatched. Despite the best efforts of the paramedics, they were unable to revive her, and Eurydice Dixon was pronounced dead at the scene. The area was cordoned off, and a murder investigation was launched. Detective Inspector Andrew Stamper asked for anyone who had been in the area between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. to come forward, as they may have seen something of significance. The police asked for anyone with dash cams or CCTV to check their footage, as anything could help them paint a clearer picture of what had happened. As the investigation continued, a post-mortem would soon reveal Eurydice's cause of death. She had died as a result of asphyxiation and compression to the neck. She had suffered blunt force injuries across her body and head, and she had also been raped. Whoever had killed her was clearly a dangerous offender, and they needed to be stopped, and quickly. The advice that was given was that people need to be aware of their own personal security. The warnings from police were met with criticism, with many arguing it placed the onus on victims. The Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, also criticized the police's response, arguing that she was keeping an eye on her surroundings, looking out for herself, being responsible, doing everything we expect. The Victoria Chief Commissioner, Graham Ashton, would later apologize, saying they had not intended it to come across as victim-blaming. When scouring the CCTV that showed her walking home, they soon noticed someone that stood out. A young man was on the footage, and he had been following her. Knowing that this was their strongest lead yet, they knew they needed to talk to him. So they released the still image of him to the media in the hope that someone would recognize him or he would come forward. And on Wednesday evening, that young man walked into a police station in Broadmeadows, James Todd. James Todd was 19 years old. The police wanted to know why he appeared to be following Eurydice on the footage. He told the police he had initially followed her as she was drunk. "Look at this drunk idiot. Might as well see if she does anything funny," he said. But this was not true. An autopsy revealed there were no drugs or alcohol in Eurydice's system. James said the night was a blur. He had a series of scratches on his face and said they had been most likely caused by his cat. But the police were doubtful. After repeatedly denying that he had any involvement over more than 600 questions, the police said they wanted to obtain his DNA and other forensic evidence, because if he wasn't involved, his DNA would not be at the scene. It was then that he changed his story. "Don't worry about the DNA. I did it. I will tell you everything," he said. The truth about James Todd and what exactly had happened would finally come out. As news continued to spread about what had happened, the tributes for Eurydice began to flood in on social media, with many comedians sharing their thoughts and donating to fundraising efforts to help her family. The Highlander bar where she had performed her last set paid tribute to her. She was a remarkable, talented, kind, unique, and universally loved person, and the entire staff are shattered and heartbroken. There were thousands of vigils held across the country, with people from all walks of life coming out to voice their anger and pay tribute to her. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull addressed a vigil in Canberra alongside the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, and said, "This young woman should have been able to walk across the park in her city as safely as she could walk across a room in her home or any public space." Bill Shorten added, "The vigil to me is a commitment to every other Australian woman that you ought to be safe, and nothing less than that is acceptable." Nearly 10,000 people went to the Melbourne Park for a vigil before the lights of the park were dimmed at 6 p.m. and the space was lit by candles. Some of those in attendance had attended the protests and vigils following the murder of Jill Marr, who was killed by a stranger as she walked home in 2012 in a case we've previously covered. Premier Daniel Andrews called Eurydice's murder a terrible, terrible tragedy, and such a waste, such a senseless, thoughtless, evil act, when he attended the vigil with his wife Katherine. A choir sang Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah as the gathering came to an end. As morning broke on Monday, shocked locals would find that Eurydice's memorial had been vandalized with lewd imagery, and people were left outraged that a memorial could be defaced in such a vile manner. Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Graham Ashton said it was terrible and shocking, and they would bring whoever was responsible to justice. As the outrage over her death continued to grow, several buildings across the country, including Melbourne's Town Hall, were lit with orange lights, the same color used by the United Nations to represent the aim of ending violence towards women and girls. The Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull also spoke about Eurydice's murder in Parliament as James Todd sat in Broadmeadows Police Station. What he had done that day, and the horrifying nature of Eurydice's last moments, were finally brought to light. On the day of Eurydice's murder, he had finished his classes in hospitality at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then got on a train to go into the city with 3 others from his college course. He later tried to purchase alcohol at Liquorland, but as he didn't have his ID on him, he was not allowed to buy anything. He went to a different store and bought vodka and cigarette rolling papers. He then went to Backman Park with his friends where they drank, before one of his friends decided to call it a day and go home. After finishing the vodka, James went and purchased cider and then some marijuana from men in the park. At 8:30 p.m., they went to the Southern Cross station and Todd purchased whiskey. They then boarded a train going towards Broadmeadows. One of them got off at Flinders Street and James Todd got off at Newmarket. He bought tobacco and then headed back into the city and got off at Flinders Street station at 10:25 p.m. He then walked towards Elizabeth Street. At 10:43 p.m., he had gone past a Woolworths where Eurydice was with Tony. James Todd carried on to McDonald's where he ate. After he walked back to the intersection of Swanston and Flinders, where Eurydice was saying goodbye to Tony as he got onto his tram. James Todd was standing outside the Yonge and Jackson Hotel, and then decided to walk back to the station. It was here that he saw Eurydice walking on her own. He let her go past him at 11 o'clock and 8 seconds p.m. He then began to follow her, being sure to hide from her and stay out of her eye line, hiding behind objects and slowing down when she did. After taking off her shoes and walking across the park, he attacked her. He had gone up behind her and grabbed her by her dress and hair before knocking her over. Eurydice had fought back with everything that she'd had and scratched his face repeatedly, but he overpowered her. After raping her, he said he strangled her for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. As her body lay in the park, he used the front-facing camera on her phone to look at the scratches on his face for 10 minutes. He then went to Royal Park Station where he fell asleep on a bench at 2:14 a.m. At 3:55 a.m., He walked back through Prince's Park, where he defecated on one of the tracks. He then walked over to where he had left her body and was told to leave the area by police on scene. At 5:50 a.m., he had got on a train to go home. And at 6:37 a.m., he was back in his bedroom and using his iPad to make various searches for Prince's Park, and read articles about a woman's body being found there in the early morning hours. He then made internet searches for content relating to rape and strangulation. At 6:34 p.m., he received a phone call from one of his friends, saying he had seen his face on the news. He was the person the police wanted to talk to. He searched the number for the local police station before ringing them to say it was him and the photograph that had been issued. His girlfriend and her mother took him to the station where his mother was there to meet him. He told his girlfriend she had nothing to worry about. After he had confessed what he had done, he told the officers she looked like she was stumbling around. She looked like she was not in a position to defend herself. James Todd was subsequently charged with the rape and murder of Ury Dixon. Using the prison telephone, he called his father. He said he was disappointed at the way Ury's murder had panned out, saying he felt like shit after and hoped the next time would be better. But who exactly was this young man sat in front of them? As the police looked into his background, they made several disturbing discoveries. He was the middle of 3 boys, and the home environment he lived in was described as neglectful and squalid. The kitchen floor was so rotten part of it had collapsed. The toilet was blocked, and garbage and rubbish filled every room. There were also several animals in the home. His mother suffered with depression and was later asked if this was a factor that led to the house being neglected. And he said, "No, it's always been like this." He had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and in his youth, James Todd exhibited repetitive behaviors and intense focus on interests, dinosaurs for example. At the age of 12, his school referred him to mental health services after they had grown increasingly concerned with his emotional well-being and his interactions with other people. As he moved into his teens, he was given treatment to help with regulating his mood, especially his anger. He spent less and less time at home and would sleep on the streets. He asked his girlfriend if he could move in and would spend his weekends at hers. Whilst in custody, Todd was diagnosed with sexual sadism disorder. Professor James Ogloff is a forensic psychologist and has more than 35 years of experience studying pedophiles, murderers, and rapists. He would later examine James Todd and spoke to The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald about sexual sadism disorder. He said that it is not entirely known how it develops in people, but that it is extremely rare. He said, "We don't know why this occurs, but we do know there are people like him whose sexual interests appear to be best satisfied by inflicting pain and ultimately ending the life of someone. It is not driven by their hatred of women. It is a sexual interest. The public wants a simple answer, but there is no quick fix." When looking at James Todd's internet search history, they revealed he had looked for snuff films, which are violent sexual encounters resulting in death. It was reported that from the age of around 11, he had been accessing increasingly violent pornography and had harbored a fantasy about raping a woman before killing her. On Thursday, June 28th, Ury Dixon's funeral was held. Her uncle, sister, and old drama teacher were amongst those who spoke at the service. "We'll Meet Again" by Johnny Cash and The Cure's Pictures of You were played. Her friend Kieran Butler described her as having the mind of a lawyer. She was someone who could attack an issue or idea from polar opposite sides. She could genuinely empathize with and understand a point of view or action that she vehemently disagreed with. The emotional service was a fitting tribute to Ury. The police would also catch up with the person who had vandalized her memorial. After he missed 5 shifts and breached the conditions of his bail by going abroad, he was sentenced to 5 months in prison. On Thursday, June 14th, James Todd appeared at Melbourne Magistrates Court. His lawyer said he should not be identified initially to allow for more time to obtain information about his autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. His lawyer also argued that identifying him could place him at risk in custody, and due to the high-profile nature of the case, it could mean it was harder to get reliable witness statements. The magistrate said that only Todd's face would be protected from being published. No application for bail was made, and he was remanded in custody. The November 8, 2018, the court heard from psychologists who discussed his sexual sadism disorder. Dr. David Thomas gave evidence for the defense and said that Todd posed a significant risk of re-offending. He said he had carried out assessment interviews with him where James Todd said the minute he went into the park, he knew there would be a sexual assault. He also said he hadn't been sure he would strangle her until he started attacking her. The court heard that with a sexual partner he had strangled her during consensual sex, but had stopped when she asked him to. Dr. Thomas said this happened very early on in the relationship. There's no evidence at all that he was at that point consuming the kind of pornography that he consumed in the months leading up to the offense. Senior Crown Prosecutor Dr. Nanette Rogers said this showed he was aware that choking could hurt someone. His defense barrister Tim Marsh said he had not planned on murdering Eurydice until the attack had started. James Todd's girlfriend and female friends testified and said that in spite of his upbringing, which was described as dysfunctional, he had always been kind and respectful towards women, with his girlfriend saying, "I found James to be a very normal person. He seemed to always be quite happy and really good socially." Another friend said that James was outgoing and would easily talk to people, even those he didn't know, saying he was someone they would often go to for advice and someone who apologized if they did something wrong. Dr. Thomas and Dr. Ogloff disagreed about how much James Todd regretted what he had done. Dr. Thomas said that once he was in custody, he had started to understand the damage he'd caused. But Dr. Ogloff said Todd had displayed profoundly disturbing behaviors after killing her, such as making the internet searches for content relating to rape and going back to the park. Todd had told Ogloff that he felt nothing. Eurydice's sister Polly also addressed the court, saying that what James Todd had done had shattered and destroyed her family. She said she was now suffering from post-traumatic stress following her sister's murder, and that she was seething in anger about what he had done. Eurydice's boyfriend Tony said he would never be able to look at human beings in the same way again. When deciding upon his sentence, the Victorian Supreme Court Justice Stephen Kay had taken on board what Professor Ogloff had said when he testified for the Crown, that James Todd had a limited chance of being rehabilitated even though he was young. He said there was a lack of evidence to suggest that Todd's sexual sadism disorder could be properly treated. In his sentencing remarks, which lasted 2 hours, Justice Kay said that Todd's actions were perverted and depraved, totally and categorically evil, and craven and sadistic. He also referred to Todd's upbringing as a mitigating factor, saying he had been raised in complete squalor. A video was submitted to the court showing a walkthrough of the house he had lived in, and Dr. Thomas said it was one of the most extreme environments he had ever seen in his career. James Todd would pose a major threat to the public if he were to be released, the judge said. Alongside this, he was sentenced to 2 years for sexual assault, 11 years for rape, and 7 years for attempted rape, which are to be served concurrently. Following the sentencing, Jeremy, Eurydice's father, spoke to the journalists outside. James Todd appealed his sentence. Following her death, new scholarships for up and coming female stand-up comedians were created in her memory, with the state government announcing it before the Melbourne International Comedy. Eurydice's father Jeremy and siblings Christopher and Polly said in a statement, "We hope these grants continue." Eurydice cared about comedy. Thanks are also due to many other people who expressed their support for Eurydice in grief at her death, and concern about violence to women, a concern that Eurydice shared in her life. The director of the festival, Susan Proven, said, "The inaugural recipients of the stand-up grants are bold, funny women, strongly committed to their comedy careers and motivated by their authentic and joyful passion for comedy. The stand-up grant is inspired by the promise and ambition of Ury Dixon, a much-loved emerging comedian whose friends remember her as brilliant, brave, and beautiful, unafraid to delve into challenging material and with a big, bold laugh that filled a room. Ury Dixon was a bright light in the Melbourne comedy circuit. She will be remembered for her intelligence, her insight, and her wit, and the impression that she left is immeasurable. She will live on through the stand-up grants, and through those young female comedians whose lives are changed by it. Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. Laurel, located in Yellowstone County, Montana, is described as a scenic, rural area on its outskirts, boasting beautiful hiking trails, camping spots, and lakes. At its heart, the town is vibrant, bustling with activity, and always offering something to do. From parades and small festivals to great shops, restaurants, and a strong sense of community. With a population of just over 7,000, one of its residents in 2019 was 57-year-old Bray. Lori worked as a runner at a local casino and, by all accounts, led a peaceful, quiet life, often keeping to herself and enjoying time at home with her 2 rescue dogs, Mac and Nikki. She came from a large, close-knit family. Lori had a son, Justin, with whom she stayed in daily contact, along with 5 grandchildren, many brothers and sisters, and 8 nieces and nephews. A dedicated animal lover, especially of dogs, Lori not only cared for Mac and Nikki but also donated to rescue centers and charities, often fostering dogs until they found permanent homes. Her boss and former roommate, Kathy, described Lori as probably the sweetest, kindest, and most gentle person she knew. Kathy noted Lori's soft-spoken nature, beautiful spirit, and welcoming smile, always eager to help anyone and someone people could rely on. Her son Justin said this could sometimes be a double-edged sword and she could be too trusting of people, never seeing the bad in anyone even when they gave her a reason to question them. September 30th, 2019 was a fairly typical day. Lori had been working the closing shift at the Cedar Ridge Casino, and just before midnight, she clocked off, locked up and left, heading straight back home as she was back in early the next day. Several hours later, October 1st, 8:30 a.m., employees at the casino noticed that Lori was unusually a no-show, but she hadn't phoned in to say why. Around the same time her boss, Kathy, was driving into work herself, down an empty and secluded road with nothing to see but fields for miles. She spotted what she thought looked like Lori's car. It was parked at an odd angle on an intersection and it didn't look like anyone was inside. Lori didn't even live close to this area, and with no shops or other houses around it made no sense for her or her car to be there. Kathy pulled over but kept her distance, and didn't get much closer to the car, instead deciding to call Justin. She asked him to go to his mother's house, wondering if she was just panicking unnecessarily. But little did she know, independently from her call, Justin also thought something felt odd about that morning. He hadn't received his usual morning call from his mother, which was strange. Justin headed to her house, ringing her phone as he did so, but the silence was deafening. When he got there, he noticed her car was not parked outside, making the knot in his stomach tighten further. He let himself in and was alarmed to find her 2 dogs, Mac and Nikki, unattended with no signs of being fed, which he knew his mother would never let happen. A look around her house turned up nothing. Her bed was neatly made. There was no indication that breakfast had been eaten that morning, and everything just felt eerily quiet. Whereas it was possible Lori had made the bed and washed everything up before leaving, it felt more like she hadn't actually made it home from the previous night. He called Kathy back and they both agreed to go and check out the car together. Justin confirmed right away that it was his mother's 2003 Chrysler sedan. The sunroof was open, a handle and indicator were broken, and inside the floor on the back he could see her purse and her car keys. Her iPhone was also on the floor, lighting up as it was receiving calls. Although Justin wanted to open the car and start properly looking, he knew in his gut that this was a job for the police and no one else. They called 911. When authorities started inspecting Lori's car, they found bloodstains covering more than half of the seat in the back, and there was a muddy shoe impression on the passenger's side door. They also found Lori's clothes scattered about too, including her underwear, which appeared damaged as if they had been forcefully removed. The hooks on her bra were bent and some of the clothing had blood on it as well. It was all pointing towards a violent and troubling scene having taken place. Lori Bray was now a missing person. Everyone sprung into action, many in the community knowing her well and wanting to help. Friends started posting on social media with one person typing, "She would never leave her dogs. They are her world. Someone has to know something. No lead is too small. And I ask that everyone please pray that she is found safe." People started organizing their own search parties as well, and everyone was out and looking for Lori. It was instantly a case that captured the media as well as the public, as it was just so unusual for something like this to happen in this area. The place where her car had been found was grassy, muddy, and the field seemed to go on forever. So looking for clues in a location like this was a big undertaking. Given the terrain, the searches were difficult anyway. But as the darkness started to creep in, things became impossible. Authorities told the volunteers to stop and wait until morning, which people reluctantly did. Police asked Kathy for the camera footage from inside the casino. She was not only able to give it to them, she was also able to say who most of the people were and give them their details so they could start interviewing them. On the night she had last been seen, Lori had been closing down as usual, restocking, cleaning, and the likes. Two women briefly started talking to her at the bar, and Kathy said she knew them. They were regulars. Another person then popped up who worked with one of the women. Kathy said his name was Diego Hernandez. Diego ordered a drink, and Lori asked to check his ID before serving him. A few minutes later, Lori could be seen pointing out the clock to him, indicating the casino was closing and he needed to leave. There was a very brief conversation before Lori carried on with the closed-down duties. At 11:20 p.m., Lori grabbed her bag, locked the door, and headed out. The casino was now closed and her car was parked just in view of one of the doors. She briefly walked back for a second, seemingly to talk to somebody, before getting into her vehicle with someone. Police quickly established it was 22-year-old Diego in the car, and at the time he got into the passenger side, he was the only person apart from Lori still on the premises. Not a single other soul was around. Detectives needed to know why he had left with her and if he had seen or heard anything that night, perhaps another customer that may have been lingering or acting oddly. Just before midnight on October 1st, Diego Hernandez was found at his address. He confirmed it was him on the cameras, and that Lori had very kindly offered to give him a lift home after they got chatting in the casino. He said he only went to the casino on a whim because he could get free drinks there. He arrived at about 9 p.m. and stayed for a couple of hours using a few machines and chatting to people. Diego said Lori drove him to his house, he said thank you and goodbye, and then he went to meet up with a friend ready to carry on the party. He said he hadn't seen Lori since he watched her drive away, and it was simply a passing encounter and a kind gesture from a stranger. But there was something that was standing out to police that they couldn't ignore. Diego's face, hands, and torso were covered with fresh scratches. One officer asked about this, saying it looked like someone had fought him off and that it was a little concerning. But Diego said the scratches had happened 2 days before when he got into a fight with a friend called Nick after going to a local strip club. He said Nick had a ring on and it had cut his face. He was very matter-of-fact and calm, confident in what he was saying, and showed no signs of being dishonest. With this, the police left. They found Nick and he admitted they had had a scuffle in his car. He said that Diego had suddenly started freaking out and was agitated. Nick said that at one point he had put Diego in a headlock before pushing him out of the vehicle, but he said there was no scratching involved, and he was shocked to see the state of his face. He had no reason to lie. He had already admitted to pushing him about and kicking him out of the vehicle, but the scratches were simply not linked to this incident. Despite what Nick had said, which did match parts of Diego's story, the fact was police had no other leads apart from him. Diego was still the last known person to have been with Lori, and by his own admission was in her car. The CCTV from Cedars Casino couldn't confirm whether the scratches were there at the time, but more footage from another bar just hours before showed that he had absolutely no marks on his face at all. Early on the October 2nd, the search party started back up and continued throughout the day. But at 7:30 p.m., detectives received the call that they had been dreading. A man had been out riding his ATV in a wooded area when he made an awful discovery. He had found the body of a woman lying naked on the ground. He didn't have to get close to tell that she was badly beaten and already dead. Police felt strongly they knew exactly who it would be, but made no announcements. However, just as word had traveled about Lori being missing, it was now traveling that an area was swarming with police and forensics, and soon it was confirmed. They had found the body of Lori Bray just under 2 miles from where her car had been dumped. She was at the bottom of a ditch, completely naked and in the fetal position. She was covered in abrasions and bruising. There was blood in her nose and in her hair, swelling around both of her eyes. She had a swollen lip and several broken ribs. Her cause of death was later confirmed as strangulation, but the examiner noted she had also suffered blunt force trauma to the face. A sexual assault kit was used, and although blood was found, no semen was. Some of the marks on her body indicated she had either been dragged down the hill or pushed down it. Not that she had been killed there. They now knew that she had probably been killed inside her own car and then transported there. Near to her body was her little necklace with a cross on it, and close to this was a fairly good imprint of a shoe. This print appeared to match the print found inside Lori's car. Lori's death and the state she had been found in was shocking. Officers said the level of violence and brutality was astonishing, commenting that whoever had done this was, put simply, a monster. Colleagues and friends were at a loss as to who would want to do this. They said Lori was loved by the regulars, had a great reputation in the community, and had never spoken about having any issues with anybody. Police did get a couple more potential leads when it came to light that she had been involved in some abusive and controlling relationships in the past, and maybe these men needed to be looked into. But Lori's exes, for various reasons, were completely ruled out. The once so tight community was now broken and scared, fearing that this might not be an isolated incident and maybe something could happen to someone else. One of the residents described Lori's death as profound and detrimental to the community as a whole. Nevertheless, everybody put their worry aside to come together for Lori's family and friends, raising money to help look after her dogs, support Justin, and donate towards the funeral costs. The police were able to find several locations where Lori's phone had pinged between midnight and 3 a.m. The casino was one where her car was found and where her body were found, and one near to Diego's house. Diego's house and that surrounding area had pinged just before the location where she was found at, by which point she would have already been killed. And this was pretty damning evidence. More interesting still, while he was in the other bar in the hours before he was at the casino, he spent the evening random women to drive him home, including the lady working behind the bar. She refused several times and said she felt very uncomfortable with his harassing behavior. On October 4th, detectives executed a search warrant at Diego's residence. They collected the clothes he was seen wearing that night, some of which looked like they had been bleached as well as freshly washed. This stood out immediately, as his room was full of dirty laundry. They also found a pair of soaking wet Nike shoes that had also just been washed. The tread of the shoes matched the print that was found inside Lori's car and near to her body. Detectives started going through Diego's phone, and it turned out that just a couple of hours after Lori had been killed, he made some interesting searches online. How long do investigations last? How long do FBI investigations last? Is there a limit to how many years they can investigate someone? He went to the station and gave the authorities a DNA sample. And then, after this, he changed his story. He said that he and Lori had spent some time talking in the car and they were getting on well. They then smoked some cigarettes and ended up having sex near his home. But he swore he hadn't seen her after that. Officers still didn't have enough to hold him, so he was allowed to go home. Everything was processed quickly, and before long they had everything they needed. Diego's DNA was a match to the DNA found on Lori's body and under her fingernails. Diego was called back in where he would change his story for a final time. He was now claiming that he and Lori had actually been in a relationship for over a year and they were just keeping it a secret. And that was why he had lied so much. She always wanted to keep it quiet, but at the same time, I don't know how to explain it, but every time that me and her had a relationship under profile, she always told me, she said to keep it quiet. Like nobody needs to know about this, he said. But detectives went back over a year on both of their phones and there was no evidence to suggest they had ever even talked before. This was corroborated by the casino cameras that showed Lori asking for his ID and only talking to him to tell him they were closing. Their phones had never made contact or been in the same locations until that night. On October 8th, just a week after Lori Bray was reported missing, Diego Hernandez was placed under arrest in connection with her death. 2 days later, he was charged with deliberate homicide. This came as such a shock to everybody in the area. Diego was well known and well liked. He always seemed polite, friendly, and quite quiet. His friends said he was down to earth and genuine, and this had left them blindsided. The police's theory was this. Given all the CCTV that seemed to show Lori getting into the car with him willingly and not under duress, indicated that Lori had offered to give him a lift home, as he had originally said, likely feeling sorry for him given how late it was. Once near his house, Diego had attempted to initiate something sexual and Lori refused. A struggle then broke out and he viciously attacked, sexually assaulted, and eventually strangled her. And the reason he was leading with the claim the pair had had consensual sex was because he knew the second his DNA was taken, they would make the link, so decided to change the narrative. Diego would never say what happened, and what if any conversations took place, but he denied ever harming her. As word started to spread that an arrest had been made, a vigil for Lori was held in her favorite park to walk her dogs. Money was still being raised and a lot of people were donating to the charities she once did so much for. Diego Hernandez pleaded not guilty and the now 24-year-old's trial began in March of 2021. He was maintaining his innocence and still claiming the pair were in a secret relationship, something which angered her family and friends, as they said this was simply not true. In opening statements, Diego's defense attorney suggested that Lori's abandoned car may have been disturbed or contaminated before being searched by law enforcement, which meant the evidence in it had to be questioned. And she mentioned that methadone was found in her system, something she did not have a prescription for. They put forward this to suggest if she was using methadone and not telling anyone, she could easily have been hiding a relationship with Diego, a theory the prosecution found ridiculous and nonsensical. The prosecution had a strong case and asked for DNA and forensic experts to testify. They said the DNA found in Lori's car, on her clothes, and under her fingernails had a 1 in 60 octillion chance of matching someone other than Diego. An octillion is 1 followed by 27 zeros. They also confirmed that the trousers found in his home had been bleached just a few hours after Lori had died. They presented the phone data too, which also gave a clear timeline of which Diego was at the center. After several days, both sides rested their cases, and just 2 hours into their deliberations, the jury returned their verdict. Diego Hernandez was found guilty. Before he was sentenced, he asked to take the stand himself. Things then took a sharp turn that nobody was expecting. The man who had been denying anything violent had happened for well over a year sat down and said, "I did it. I killed Lori." The room was stunned. The judge said he had never seen this happen in his 4 decades in a courtroom. That day, Diego Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years to serve before he could be considered for parole. There is no indication whether or not he has made plans to appeal. Lori Bray's case deeply affected many people, those that knew her well and those that had never met her before. The community felt a collective sense of loss, and one resident said it really changed a lot about the closeness and safeness everybody had always felt. They had all lost a really special person. Kathy said of Lori, "There's nothing she wouldn't do for anybody, even if it caused a hardship on her. She was just a very tender, loving soul. No matter what anybody did, she saw the good in everybody." 17-year-old Mary Jane Reed lived in Oregon, Illinois, with her family in the Sandtown neighborhood, situated to the east of the Rock River. This modest area was often considered the wrong side of town by some. Mary Jane was the 5th of 6 children, with her father, Clifford, working as a machine repairman at the National Silica Company plant. She was 11 years older than her younger brother Warren, to whom she was very devoted. Mary Jane would take Warren to the movies, church, and on long walks, often packing picnic lunches for them to enjoy at a park by the river. At 15, she began teaching Sunday school and earned a certificate from Oregon Bible College. Mary Jane had left Oregon High School during her sophomore year to help care for her ailing mother, Ruth, whose severe rheumatoid arthritis made it difficult for her to manage basic household tasks. To support her family financially, Mary Jane took a job as a switchboard operator for the DeKalb Ogle Telephone Company, using her earnings to buy items for the home. It was through this job that she met 28-year-old Stanley Skridla, a World War II veteran. Stanley, one of 5 children, was born and raised in Rockford, Illinois, located 25 miles northeast of Oregon. After finishing school, he worked as a cabinet maker and machinist before enlisting in the Navy in October 1943. He served in the Pacific aboard the USS Ormsby as a machinist's mate, initially 3rd class and later 2nd class. He was honorably discharged in December 1945 and began working as a lineman for the Illinois Bell Telephone Company in February 1946. Stanley lived with his widowed mother on Loomis Street in Rockford. Stanley met Mary Jane by speaking to her over the phone during phone calls he made to test phone wires he was working on in the Oregon area. Mary Jane and Stanley made plans to have their first date on June 25, 1948. That day, Mary Jane worked the 6 to 10 p.m. shift at the phone company. Stanley called her to confirm their plans that afternoon, but she was not able to call him back until 8:30. Stanley then drove to Oregon from Rockford to meet Mary Jane when she finished work. Mary Jane and Stanley were seen at 2 or 3 bars around Oregon that night. They were last seen outside a local tavern, speaking with an unknown man and woman around 11:30 that night. Neither Mary Jane nor Stanley arrived home that night. After leaving the final tavern they visited, Mary Jane and Stanley had apparently driven to a lover's lane along Country Line Road on the southern outskirts of town. Early the following morning, a state highway worker was driving down that road on his way to set up some fishing lines. On his way, he came across a man's Oxford shoe in the middle of the gravel road. When he stopped to investigate, he found the body of Stanley Skridla in a ditch on the side of the road. He had been shot 5 times, once in the chest and 4 times in the lower abdomen. It was estimated that he was killed between 1 and 2 a.m. According to authorities, it appeared Stanley had been pulled from his car and shot. His body had then been dragged off to the side of the road. At the scene, they found a large pool of blood, a cigarette stained with red lipstick, and 5 .32 caliber shells. Stanley's car was located a short time later, parked approximately a mile away from the scene, in a parking lot across the street from one of the establishments he and Mary Jane had visited the previous night. There was no he and Mary Jane had visited the previous night. There was no blood inside of the car. No one could find Mary Jane Reed. Local and county authorities began a massive search for the missing girl and received help from local volunteers. Hundreds of people were a part of the effort, searching remote areas in and outside of Oregon. The Reed family held on to hope that Mary Jane was still alive. These hopes were bolstered when they received a phone call from a psychic who assured them that Mary Jane was not dead. She was unharmed, but being held captive by a man with a dark complexion and would return home soon. Desperate as they were for information, the family found solace in this account. The psychic's vision was proven wrong on June 29th, for days after Mary Jane disappeared, when a 28-year-old truck driver named Harold Sigler discovered her body. Harold worked for the National Silica Company, who also employed Mary Jane's father. On the morning of 29th, Harold was driving down a company lane, approximately 2 miles away from the Lover's Lane where Stanley's body had been found to reach a sandpit owned by the company, from which he was to haul sand. He stopped along the way to speak with another driver, and when he left his truck he noticed a foul smell and discovered Mary Jane's body amongst the weeds under a box elm tree, some 4 feet off of the road. Mary Jane was wearing just her bra, underwear, and her mother's wedding ring. Ruth had given her the ring as a gift once her arthritis prevented her from wearing it, and Mary Jane had been thrilled to have it. The rest of the clothing Mary Jane had been wearing the last night she was alive had been thrown on top of her body. According to her death certificate, Mary Jane had been shot once in the back of her head, near the base of her skull. She, like Stanley, had been shot with a .32 caliber bullet, believed to be the same weapon used to kill Stanley. Authorities believed that she had not been held captive when she was taken from the Lover's Lane, but had rather been killed not long after Stanley's death. Ruth Reed was so distraught over death of her daughter and fearful that the same fate would befall another member of her family, that she refused to allow her son, Warren, to attend school for months. Clifford Reed ultimately made the decision to place her in a state mental institution a year after Mary Jane died. Ruth returned home after a year, but was never the same. Investigators spoke to dozens of people to try to find leads in the case. Mary Jane had been very popular, regularly going on dates, so authorities spoke to other young men she had socialized with. They also interviewed 4 women in Rockford Stanley had previously dated. Rumors circulated that the murders were the result of a love triangle gone wrong or payback from some sort of gambling debt Stanley had accrued. The theory in the case that became perhaps the most popular and persistent was that Mary Jane and Stanley had been killed by a local chief deputy sheriff. He and Mary Jane had a brief relationship, but Mary Jane no longer wanted to be involved with the older married man. On the afternoon before Mary Jane went missing, he showed up at her home to try to convince her to continue seeing him. He grabbed her by the arm as she struggled to get away from him. He struck her several times before throwing her to the ground and finally leaving. The deputy reportedly also ran into Mary Jane at one of the bars she and Stanley visited while out on their date, meaning that he had known she was out with another man. According to a police report at the time, the deputy had reported to work the day after Stanley's body was discovered without his service weapon, claiming he had sold it to someone in a bar. This led to whispers around town that police had not solved the case because they were covering up for one of their own. The deputy passed away in the mid-1980s. As the years went on, rumors and speculation continued, but progress in the case came to a halt, and it remained unsolved for decades. Over those decades, both of Mary Jane's parents, as well as all but one of her siblings, passed away without learning who killed her. The lack of answers in the case did not diminish local interest in the story or hope in Mary Jane's brother, Warren Reed, that it would eventually be resolved. Major developments in the case would come more than 50 years after Mary Jane and Stanley were murdered, with the help of a somewhat controversial local figure. Mike Arians had worked as an insurance fraud investigator, a dinner theater producer, and a county commissioner in King County, Illinois before he purchased a restaurant in Oregon. Now known as the Roadhouse, the establishment had previously been known as the Stenhouse and had been one of the places Stanley and Mary Jane had visited the night they were killed. Stanley's Buick had been found parked across the street from it after his body was discovered. Mike purchased the restaurant the year of the 50th anniversary of Mary Jane and Stanley's murders. As such, the story was featured heavily in the local media and caught Mike's attention. However, he soon decided to run for mayor of Oregon, which diverted his focus from the case until after his election to the position in April of 1999. Perhaps because of his own modest background, Mike became increasingly concerned that Mary Jane Reed had been viewed by the authorities at the time of her murder as disposable because she came from the lower-class area of Sandtown. He began hearing more details about the case from people around town, which led to him reaching out to people connected to the case, including Mary Jane's brother, Warren. While Mike claims he simply wants justice for Mary Jane and Stanley, he does have detractors who view him as either obsessive or opportunistic rather than altruistic. Mr. Arians is full of it. He's a jerk. He's trying to make money. Melvin Messer, a former Ogle County sheriff, told the Chicago Tribune in 2012. Allegations that Mike has tried to use Mary Jane and Stanley's deaths for his own profit stem largely from his efforts to get a book written and a movie made about the case. Neither of those projects ever came to fruition. Mary Jane specifically also plays a part in Mike's restaurant business. Mike has what some have described as a shrine to her at the Roadhouse, featuring numerous framed pictures and articles, a portrait drawn in pencil, and a mannequin dressed as Mary Jane. While this could be viewed as a marketing ploy, Mike claims he has all the items on display to celebrate Mary Jane's life and make sure she is not forgotten. Mary Jane did visit what is now the Roadhouse just hours before her death, and Mike believes that visit continues to tie her to his restaurant. He has repeatedly said that he does not particularly like the term haunted, but he does believe that Mary Jane maintains a determined presence in his restaurant. He claims that employees have seen apparitions in the restaurant and points to events like the repeated spontaneous playing of the same song on the jukebox and unexplained gusts of cold air in the Roadhouse as evidence of Mary Jane's presence there. He has held seances in the restaurant, which was also featured on an episode of the Travel Channel show, The Dead Files. According to Mike, his critics are wrong to claim that he has financially benefited from his investigation into the case. Business at the restaurant went down dramatically after he became involved with the case, and within just the first few years of his efforts, he had personally spent tens of $1,000 doing research and hiring private investigators. He further claims that his interest in Mary Jane and Stanley's case was part of the reason he lost his bid for re-election as mayor of Oregon in 2003. There are, of course, other reasons which could explain why the people of Oregon did not vote to re-elect Mike. For example, in December of 1999, He was indicted on charges of official misconduct and disregard of election laws in relation to his legal place of residence at the time he held his different government positions. In order to be qualified to serve as mayor of Oregon, he had to have been a legal resident of the town, which is in Ogle County, for at least a year prior to his election in April of 1999. However, he had been a county commissioner in Kane County, a position which required him to be a legal resident of that county until the end of 1998. Mike subsequently filed a civil lawsuit against the Kane County State's attorney, alleging prosecutorial misconduct. Proceedings dragged on for almost 2 years. In October of 2001, Mike ultimately dropped his lawsuit and paid a fine to settle the matter, but the legal case could also be viewed as a potential reason for why Mike was not re-elected, rather than his investigation into Mary Jane and Stanley's death. Regardless of the criticisms that have been made of him, Mike did play a major part in the significant developments in the case made decades after Mary Jane and Stanley were killed. In January of 2004, Mike filed court documents requesting that Mary Jane's body be exhumed from her grave in Daysville Cemetery, a process he was willing to pay for himself. Mike hoped that DNA could be found and used to identify a suspect. Furthermore, he argued that there were several problems with the original investigation that could only be resolved by exhuming Mary Jane's remains. No formal autopsy was performed on Mary Jane's body in 1948. Neither her nor Stanley's death certificates had been signed by the coroner, and his name had simply been typewritten onto the line where his signature should have been made. Mike also claimed that his investigation had raised concerns that Mary Jane's skull had not been buried with the rest of her body. A judge signed off on the exhumation in July of 2005, and it took place the following month. On the morning of August 23, 2005, Mary Jane's remains were exhumed and x-rayed at Burchell Community Hospital before being examined by forensic pathologists at the Ogle County Morgue. The 6-hour examination was videotaped and photographed. Several of Mary Jane's fingernails were collected, as were several pubic hairs and various swabs to check for any evidence of sexual assault. The skull, several vertebrae, and a femur were not sent back to the cemetery, but the rest of the remains, so that further forensic testing and examination could be performed on them. Mary Jane had been buried still wearing her mother's gold wedding ring, which was given to her brother Warren after the examination. Warren felt the process had been handled properly and that the pathologists who had examined the remains had been very respectful. Mary Jane's remains were reinterred in the afternoon of the day of the exhumation with a Bible signed by Warren Reed. His son, his daughter, and Micarians tucked inside the casket with her. While there was a skull buried in Mary Jane's casket, it proved to be one of the most confusing and controversial pieces of evidence in the case. Warren Reed had struggled to obtain the bones that had not been reinterred after the exhumation following their initial review by the Illinois State Police. He wanted other experts to examine the bones, but authorities wanted to cremate them before returning them to him. He eventually received custody of them, and Mike Arians had the skull and vertebrae examined by forensic experts. Those experts determined that the skull found in Mary Jane's casket was not Mary Jane's. This realization was made by examining the C1 and C2 vertebrae, the cervical vertebrae closest to the skull. The C1 vertebrae belonged with the skull, and the C2 vertebrae belonged with the vertebra below it, but the C1 and C2 vertebrae did not fit together as they should have, instead forming what the experts described as an impossible articulation. The experts determined the skull and C1 vertebra came from a girl around the same age Mary Jane had been at the time of her death, but the bones they had been given to examine came from two different individuals. Furthermore, the skull did show signs that the person it belonged to had been shot in the head. However, the bullet hole showed that the owner of the skull had been shot in the face to the left of her nose. Mary Jane's death certificate indicates that she had been shot in the back of her head, near the base of her skull. In late 2005, following the exhumation, the Ogle County Sheriff's Office opened a new investigation into Mary Jane and Stanley's case. Based on the results of that investigation, the Sheriff's Office announced that they had come to the conclusion that a man from Waterloo, Iowa had killed Stanley during a botched robbery while his brother, a resident of Oregon, looked on. They took Mary Jane with them, ultimately deciding to kill her to eliminate her as a witness. Both of the brothers had since passed away. The sheriff's office could not formally close the case or conclusively tie the brothers to the crime. However, and only classified them as persons of interest in the case. The report also specifically stated that the investigation had found no evidence supporting the popular local theory that the deputy sheriff had been involved in the murders. Ogle County Sheriff's Captain, Rich Wilkinson, did note in his report that his investigation indicated that social and political considerations may have influenced the original investigation, and that important evidence went undocumented or unshared with the proper agencies. This investigation, in my opinion, was corrupt and mishandled from the start, and nothing I am aware of can possibly change those facts, he wrote. Examining Mary Jane's remains raised more questions than it answered, but Mike Arians did eventually contact Stanley's remaining family members to secure their support for him petitioning the court to allow for the exhumation of Stanley's remains as well. The request for the exhumation was ultimately granted, and it occurred on May 28, 2015 at Calvary Catholic Cemetery in Winnebago, Illinois. Stanley's remains were X-rayed and examined. 232 caliber bullets were located and submitted to the Illinois State Crime Lab for analysis. 7 months later, the sheriff's office released a statement about the lab's findings. Only one of the bullets had been in good enough condition to be used for comparison, and it had been compared to a .32 caliber handgun that had been identified during the course of the investigation. The gun had not fired the bullet. The statement concluded by stating that the sheriff's office believed that everyone involved in Mary Jane and Stanley's murders had since passed away. While disinterring Stanley did not provide evidence that solved the case, it did ultimately have a positive result. Stanley's wooden casket had been found submerged in a foot of water inside of his burial vault and was in poor shape. When his remains were reinterred on the afternoon of 28th, they were in a new casket. A Catholic priest presided over a graveside service, and an honor guard from the local VFW chapter fired a salute. These signs of respect for Stanley and his memory were all appreciated by his nephew. Following Stanley's exhumation and the subsequent testing, Mike Arians took a step back from actively investigating the case, having spent countless hours and more than $100,000 on the case. "I've done all that I can do," he told Ted Gregory of the Chicago Tribune. "Hopefully my efforts over the past 17 years haven't been in vain, and that enough of the dots that I've created can be connected that law enforcement can color in the picture. That would be a perfect world for me." Light continued speaking with Ted Gregory for his 2017 book on the case, and maintains a website dedicated to it. While recent efforts to use modern technology to solve the decades-old mystery of who killed Mary Jane Reed and Stanley Skridla have so far not been successful in that objective, they have ensured that Mary Jane and Stanley's memories live on more than 70 years after their deaths. Just 10 minutes from Capel Laffern lies a cliff, where 30-year-old Michael Kerr lived with his family. Michael's life had not always been easy. When he was born, the delivery was very quick, and doctors described him as a severely ill baby, giving him only a 30% chance of surviving the night. Yet, against all odds, he pulled through. Doctors told his parents, Patricia and Jim, that Michael would likely never be able to walk. However, on his 3rd birthday, Michael stood up and ran across the room. Doctors also said he would never be able to ride a bike, so Patricia bought him one. Before long, Michael was riding his bike regularly, proving once again that he could defy expectations. He attended harbor school in Dover. At the age of 6, Michael was diagnosed with Fragile X syndrome, a genetic condition that causes various developmental delays. But by the time he was 9, doctors dismissed this diagnosis. His mother later expressed her belief that Michael actually had cerebral palsy. Regardless of any challenges, Michael never let anything hold him back. He grew into a joyful and humorous boy, always full of energy. Patricia described him as having a cheeky grin and a mischievous personality. He had a slight stammer when he spoke and struggled with hand-eye coordination, but none of it stopped him from pursuing his passions, one of which was music. Michael had big dreams and wanted to make it as a DJ. He loved nothing more than DJing for the clubs and pubs in the local area, playing a huge range of music that reflected his diverse tastes. After passing his driving test, Michael's love of cars and driving grew too, and he was over the moon to buy his first car, a Renault Clio, a motor he adored. He would often drive into Dover and offer folks rides home for petrol money when the pubs had taken their last orders. He was always looking to help, and make sure people got home safe, especially the young female pub and club goers. This kind-hearted and giving nature made him extremely popular and well-loved amongst the locals and the wider community. But his mother Patricia said that some would take advantage of his helpfulness and good nature, such as with him giving them lifts and money, and she also said that he didn't see the bad in people. Wednesday, April 10, 2013. Satmar Lane is a quiet and secluded country lane in Capel Laffern. It's surrounded by fields and ponds and has an embankment running along each side. It was here that a disturbing discovery was made. Patricia said that she had woken that morning feeling sick and anxious, nervous that something bad was going to happen. Then came the knock at the door that every parent dreads. She opened the door to a woman who asked if she was Michael Kerr's mother. She said that she was. The officer simply replied, "I'm sorry." Michael Kerr's body had been found at the end of Satmar Lane, a few yards away from his Renault Clio, that had been wedged up against the embankment. There were major wounds across his body and neck, and it was clear to the officers that they were dealing with a sadistic murder. It appeared that there had been an attempt to move his body, which was surrounded by a pool of blood, and there was also significant blood spatter in his car. His cousin Linda was away with the family in a little holiday village, and Michael was due to head down and join them. She then began receiving numerous calls and messages. It was then that she learned her beloved cousin had died. For those that knew him, they were in shock. Michael was loved by so many, and nobody could understand why anyone would want to hurt him. As news began to spread throughout the community, people could not believe that a crime this brutal and violent had happened. Police had swarmed Capel Laffern, and this quiet little part of the UK had been turned completely upside down. The murder had been a violent and incredibly frenzied one. Michael had been stabbed 10 times and had 11 slash wounds to his body. 2 of his teeth were also found underneath his body. Severe force had been used to smash them out of his mouth. He had defensive wounds, but they were few, meaning he had potentially been caught unawares or lost so much blood in such a short space of time that it had left him physically unable to do anything. Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Fotheringham said that the police had decided to take the unusual step and asked a pathologist to come to the scene to carry out assessments and take samples as the body lay in situ, a decision that is only taken in the most serious of cases. But the pathologist was unable to make it, and the weather was beginning to turn. So a tent was erected around his body before he was taken away to the mortuary. The task that lay in front of the police officers was enormous. They needed to search all around the area for any clues that could lead them to what had happened, and to whoever was responsible. A huge team of officers were searching the lane, and divers were dispatched to search the ponds nearby. His phone was missing, but his wallet was still there, and it didn't appear to have been touched, meaning it did not seem to be a robbery that had gone wrong, leaving them still hunting for a motive. Did his phone contain evidence that pointed to his killer, and was that why it was missing? Given the position of his Renault Clio, it seemed that someone had attempted to use his car to drive away from the scene of the crime but abandoned it when they couldn't drive it over the bank. There were so many questions and so few answers. Rumors soon began to swirl within the local area. The port of Dover was not far away, with people coming into the country and going out of it all the time. Had this been an opportunistic killing by someone who wasn't even in the area anymore? Had he been ambushed? Had it been planned? The police needed to speak to people, including those that knew him best, so they could work out which theories to rule in and which to rule out. During their door-to-door inquiries, someone living in a house roughly 100 meters away from where his body had been found said that they had heard what appeared to be shouting and screams on the night he was killed, but said that it sounded more like people were having fun than someone in distress. As the search of the lane continued, they finally got their first big lead. Michael's phone that had been missing was found, smashed, seemingly stamped on, before being kicked into the hedge at the side of the road. It was quickly sent off to see if any clues could be gathered from it. They also needed to find the murder weapon. Whilst nothing was found in the search of the ponds or along the sides of the road, a search of the drains on the main road that Satmar Lane led off would be a different story. 2 knives were found thrown down one of the drains. Did more than one weapon mean there was more than one killer? Several days after Michael's death, a memorial was held for him, with people turning out in droves to pay their respects. One of Michael's friends said it looked like all of Dover had turned up. Patricia was incredibly touched that so many had come together to honor her son and his memory. It was clear that he had meant so much to so many people, and it highlighted just how loved and respected he was by those in his community. As the investigation into Michael Kerr's murder continued, there would be another huge breakthrough. Someone had called the police and asked that officers be sent to Clarendon Street in Dover as their friends had just confided in them with a shocking story. 5 people were arrested on suspicion of murder. They were all young adults in their 20s who lived together on Clarendon Street. All of them were taken to the station to be questioned and interviewed. 3 of them, men aged 20, 22, and 27, would later be released without charge. The remaining 2 were not. 22-year-old Alicia Davies and 21-year-old Charlotte Colson were kept in custody. Alicia Davies had been an air cadet and was originally from Aylsham. She had met Charlotte Colson in the busy nightlife of Dover. The pair had moved in together 6 months before and lived on Clarendon Street. They were described as being well known within the local area and had reputations for drinking heavily. Charlotte explained to the interviewing officers that she had known Michael for roughly a year and that he had given her lifts home and also ferried her to the supermarket. Alicia had been introduced to him just a few weeks before his death. Michael's cousin Linda said she had seen them in his car and had also witnessed him going into a shop to purchase alcohol for them. During their interviews, they said that they had both met with him twice on the day he had been killed. They said that at around 8 in the evening, he had picked up Alicia and driven her to Satmar Lane, where they stayed for a while before he purchased alcohol and drove her back to Clarendon Street. They said that they had stayed home and drank, and Michael had then come back at around midnight. They said he had picked them both up with Elisha in the passenger seat and Charlotte sat in the back, and he had driven once again to Satmar Lane. Alicia then made a startling accusation. She said that Michael had raped and attacked her. She said in a bid to protect herself, she had put her hands down the side of the car seat, where she found a knife and proceeded to stab him in self-defense. Charlotte said she had been asleep in the back and had woken up to Alicia stabbing him, adding that she had been unable to get out of the car as it had no doors for the back seats. She said that the pair had then attempted to move Michael's body and then drive away in his Renault, but the car had stalled. So they left it on Satmar Lane and proceeded to walk home, leaving Michael lying on his own, bleeding to death. The police needed to ascertain if their stories checked out and if the argument of self-defense was a plausible one. What was unusual was that the pair had no history of violence and had never had any run-ins with the law, so for them to be responsible for such a violent crime was shocking. The officers spoke to locals to try and gather CCTV footage, and Michael's car was caught driving past in the early morning hours, and mobile phone data analysis also confirmed this timeline. Mobile phone data also showed something that caught the eye of the police. Text messages had been sent between Alyssa and Charlotte as the car had arrived in the village. The messages had been deleted. Charlotte said, "Start now." Alicia replied saying, "You're gonna have to do it first." Charlotte's last message read, "Shut up and hurry. Let's party." These messages were sent within 3 minutes of his Renault being caught on CCTV. This revelation blew huge holes in what Charlotte had said, that she had been asleep in the back and had no idea what was going on when she woke up. The knives that had been found also raised more questions with their story. When the house on Clarendon Street had been searched, there were 2 knife sets there. Both knives found in the drain were missing from said sets. The argument that the knife had been found down the side of the car seat and that she had killed him to stop him attacking her made no sense. It showed that the knives had been taken from the house they had lived in, and this coupled with the text messages showed that this had been a pre-planned and thought-out attack. The evidence against them continued to mount. A fire had been set in the back garden of the house on Clarendon Street and items of clothing had been burned, including Charlotte's favorite gray hoodie that had blood on it. When the other residents of the house came home, they said they had been putting clothes into the washing machine which matched the clothes they had been wearing before the attempt to set them on fire was made. With all of the evidence stacking up against them, 22-year-old Alicia Davis and 21-year-old Charlotte Colson were charged with the murder of Michael Kerr. Charlotte entered a plea of not guilty. Alicia didn't appear in court due to illness but would also plead not guilty, and they were remanded in custody to await trial where they would be tried together. Due to the severity and seriousness of the case, it was sent to the Old Bailey Courthouse in London for trial in December 2013. Judge Paul Worsley would preside. Before the judge and jury came into the courtroom, the pair would sit and laugh, seemingly unbothered by the seriousness of the situation. But when in the presence of both judge and jury, they would then sit with their heads down and not look up. They continued their story of self-defense. His cousin Linda said the accusation they had made showed how evil they were. This was a crime they had planned and had then attempted to besmirch Michael's name to cover it up. The prosecution needed to knock holes in their defense, and Alicia's version of events needed to be shown to be false. The police and prosecution had Michael's beloved Renault Clio driven to the Old Bailey, where it was parked in the rear yard. The judge and jury were then invited to look at it. The car itself was very small, showing that her allegation of him undressing himself and taking her clothes off too before attacking her in such a tiny space made no sense. Prosecutor Sarah Woodhouse said there was never any rape, but they put their heads together and concocted a vicious story about Michael Kerr in order to exonerate themselves. Text messages from Charlotte's phone showed that she had messaged Michael's phone after he had been murdered, asking why they hadn't heard from him and why he had failed to pick them up when he said he would. Something Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Fotheringham said was a clear and deliberate attempt to both cover their tracks and misguide the police, allowing them to say that they hadn't seen him. Alicia had also messaged him saying, "I feel so sick. I love you." Charlotte's last message to him was sent to his phone at 5:47 a.m., and she told him she was unable to fall asleep. But Charlotte continued to maintain that she hadn't been involved. The two knives that were found would bring her defense into serious doubt. The injuries were all across his body, suggesting it had not been the work of one person. The judge agreed that Charlotte had been involved, and that she had been the one to cause the injuries to his neck, by grabbing his hair and chin from behind and cutting his throat several times. The knife wound that Alicia admitted to making showed that she had actually repositioned the knife after stabbing him to ensure that the stab wound would pierce his heart. Michael would not have stood a chance against them. Alicia's defense lawyer, Paul Bogan, said that she was currently being treated into psychiatric care, and that she had suffered abuse at the hands of her father as a child. He did say, however, that she had committed a sustained, unrelenting, and particularly violent attack. Michael's heartbroken parents, Jim and Patricia, sat and quietly wiped away tears as the horrible details of what had happened to their son were laid bare. More would also come out about why they had met with him. He'd been texting them frequently on the April 9th and had been in regular contact with them in the hours before he died. Alicia would say she had actually had sex with Michael for money, and that Charlotte had been the one to organize it, as they needed 20 pounds for alcohol. Charlotte had sent Michael a message saying that Alicia would have sex with him if he paid her. The possible motive for why they had killed him began to emerge. Knowing that she had slept with him for money, with Michael being more vulnerable, it could have led him to believe he had a girlfriend and was in a relationship with Alicia. Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Fotheringham said that rather than explain to him that that was not what it was, they decided to kill him. After killing him, CCTV was shown to the court proving that they had appeared to go about their night as normal by later visiting a McDonald's and going to buy alcohol. As they returned home, they were heard laughing and joking with each other by neighbors. After hearing all of the evidence, the trial concluded after 3 weeks. And before long, the jury had returned its verdict. 22-year-old Alicia Davis and 21-year-old Charlotte Carlson were unanimously found guilty of the murder of Michael Kerr. The pair both burst into tears as the verdict was read out. Charlotte Carlson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. Alicia Davis received a sentence of life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. Michael's devastated mother Patricia said that the pair should have received longer sentences. She said, "So many people have said an eye for an eye. I don't want that. No, I don't want them to die. Because in my head, every night when those lights are out, they see and they hear and they are haunted by what they did to my boy, and it torments them." Judge Worsley told the pair, "You both sat upon him. He was an easy victim. He inflicted no injuries on either of you and had defense wounds from trying to protect himself from the repeated slashing and stabbing. Rather than remorse or shock, you have felt some perverse pleasure in watching him die and were heard laughing as you traveled home along the road. Neither of you have shown any remorse. Your only desire is to save your own skins." He added he totally rejected the claim of rape and said that they had lied continuously to the police. His family said in a statement, Michael was the innocent victim of a ruthless and brutal, unprovoked attack which has resulted in him being taken from his family and friends. The pain we have experienced and are still suffering from cannot be expressed in words. Today's verdict, whilst not bringing him back, has provided us with some comfort, knowing that those responsible for his death will serve a number of years in prison. However, no sentence can ever come close to the pain that Michael has endured. Michael Kerr was a loving, kind and gentle man who was always looking to help people in need, people he didn't even know. He had gone through so much but always looked on the bright side of life and brought joy to those around him. His death left a void that will never be filled for so many people, but they will forever carry with them the memories he created and the love that he gave. Katherine Janaro grew up in a loving home in the North York area of Toronto as the only child of Donora and Fernando Janaro, who had immigrated to Canada from Portugal. She was a happy, intelligent, and active child, excelling in school as a straight-A student. She won spelling bees, participated in track and field, and performed in talent shows. However, things began to change for Katherine when she was 16 and ran away from home with a boyfriend. The couple moved to Bray, Ontario, just over an hour away from Katherine's family home. A little over a year later, Katherine gave birth to their daughter, Dawn. In the summer of 1993, when Dawn was 1, Katherine and her boyfriend separated. After the split, Katherine and Dawn settled into a basement apartment on Dunlop Street West in Bray. Despite her parents' offer for her to move back home, Katherine declined, saying she preferred to stay in Bray to remain close to her friends. Those friends may not have been worth staying in town for. According to Katherine's cousin, Rex Marrow, she had fallen in with the wrong crowd following her separation from her boyfriend. While Katherine would always help others who were going through a difficult time, she could not help herself. Katherine was very active in Barry's bar scene and was out drinking on Sunday, October 9, 1994, staying out until the early morning hours of October 10th, which was Thanksgiving in Canada that year. She went out to bars in downtown Bray before inviting several of the people she had met at the bars back to her apartment. Just before 8 o'clock on Monday night, October 10th, 20-year-old Katherine's body was discovered on the floor of her apartment surrounded by blood by some of her friends. Her autopsy would find that she had died of multiple stab wounds and had sustained several scratches to her face. Dawn was thankfully not at the apartment at the time of the murder, as she was spending the holiday weekend with her grandparents. She remained in their care after her mother's death. The Bray Police Service originally led the investigation into Katherine's murder, receiving support from Provincial Police's Forensic Identification Bureau. Physical evidence was collected and sent to the Centre for Forensic Sciences in Toronto and to a private lab. Numerous interviews were conducted. Katherine had ties to the local drug trade, and the theory in case was that robbery had been the motive for the murder. Katherine's telephone had been ripped from the wall and was missing from her apartment, leading authorities to speculate that her killer may have taken it because their contact information was stored in the phone's memory. The phone was eventually discovered in a creek near Katherine's apartment building. While the memory was somehow still intact, it did not reveal any important information. Police identified 6 suspects they believed participated in or had knowledge of the crime, but could not prove that any one of them was Katherine's killer. In October of 1999, the case was turned over to the Ontario Provincial Police so that they could use an unspecified investigative technique in the case that the Bray Police Service did not have access to. This technique was never able to identify Katherine's killer, and the case was transferred back to the Bray Police Service in February of 2012. While decades passed without an arrest in the case, this was not because of a lack of effort from the police in Bray. Experts in various scientific and law enforcement fields in both Canada and the United States were consulted on the evidence in the case. More 350 witnesses were interviewed as a part of the investigation. In 2014, Bray Police Detective Rob Gravel stated that he believed he knew the identity of the killer. He claimed that the man was local and that he was keeping tabs on him. He hoped that was close to finally being able to make an arrest in the case. 2 men were under police surveillance in connection with the case at the time. Police optimism in the case was largely due to continuing improvements in DNA technology. DNA had been found at the crime scene, but the various sources of it had become mixed. Technology was advancing to the point where they hoped the different profiles could be isolated and separately identified. Police held a press conference in October of 2014 following the 20th anniversary of Katherine's murder, discussing their ongoing investigation. Katherine's daughter, Dawn Nelson, was present at the press conference, but Katherine's parents, Donora and Fernando, were absent as they had both passed away. Their daughter's death was devastating to them, and they both became extremely depressed following it. Later in their lives, they both developed cancer. Janaro died in May of 2012 and Fernando died in January of 2014. They're both in a better place right now, reunited with my mother, but it was a tough way to get there. Katherine's then 22-year-old daughter, Dawn, said at the press conference, "Now I stand alone, holding on to the hope that there will be justice in my mother's case. I hope to one day have closure to what has caused me so much pain. It will be more than another 6 years before that day finally came." On January 13, 2021, 58-year-old Robert Bruce McQueen was arrested in the south end of Bray and charged with Katherine's murder. The name Robert Bruce McQueen was not necessarily well known in Bray, but his alias, Bruce Ellis, was. He had begun using his stepfather's last name of Ellis rather than his birth name of McQueen following his mother's remarriage when he was young. According to individuals who grew up with McQueen and spoke to the press following his arrest, the person they knew as Bruce Ellis had a reputation as someone you did not want to mess around with. He was a tough guy, prone to violence, who never finished high school because he was in and out of jail so frequently. As an adult, he worked various odd jobs, mainly in construction. Due to the ongoing legal case against McQueen, any specific details about the evidence against him have not yet been released to the public. According to police, McQueen's arrest was made following a tip about him they received in 2019. It has not been revealed if DNA or any other physical evidence ties him to the murder. Police say that Katherine and McQueen knew each other, but have not provided further details on what their relationship was. It is unclear if McQueen was one of the original 6 suspects identified in the case or one of the 2 men under surveillance in 2014. Bray Police Communications Coordinator, Peter Leon, has only specified that McQueen was known to investigators. Due to the pandemic, McQueen's first 2 court appearances on January 14, 2021 have been held via video conference. At his second appearance, he said he did not yet have a lawyer to represent him, but believed he would have one secured by the end of that day. His next court appearance is scheduled for January 28th. The first-degree murder charge against McQueen has not yet been proven in a court of law. Following McQueen's arrest for her mother's murder, Dawn Nelson released a statement through the Bray Police Service. "I want to thank those who never gave up hope in looking for my mother's murderer," she said in it. "I wish my grandparents, Donora and Fernando Janaro, were alive to see this day. Grief is the most familiar feeling to me. Closure on my mother's case will help to finally bring me some peace." On July 5, 1966, around 2 p.m., a young couple entered Roper's Motel in Pecos, Texas, some 200 miles east of El Paso. The girl was believed to be between 17 and 20 years old with an olive complexion and dark hair. She was approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall and 120 pounds. She was dressed in a flower-patterned shirt and dark-colored shorts. The man with her was slightly older, approximately 25 years old with blonde hair and an average build. He was estimated to be around 5 feet 7 inches tall. The couple registered at the motel as Mr. and Mrs. Russell Batown. 3 hours after they checked into their room, while the man was taking a nap in the room, the young woman went out to go swimming in the motel's pool. No one else was swimming at the time. The 16-year-old granddaughter of the motel's owner then heard screaming coming from the pool area. When she reached it, she saw the young woman unconscious in the pool. She pulled her from the water and began attempting to resuscitate her. An ambulance was called and the young woman was taken to the hospital, but she was declared dead when she arrived. Her death certificate would list her cause of death as drowning. After the man who had been traveling with the young woman was informed of what happened, he left the motel. He convinced motel staff to let him take the registration card for the room with him, claiming he had no other form of identification to use when he reached the hospital. However, he never went to the hospital to inquire about the young woman he had been traveling with and had told motel staff was his wife. He was last seen driving a late model sedan, but left town and was never seen again after he left the motel. He took all of his and the young woman's belongings with him. Authorities had no means of identifying the man who had not used his real name to register at the motel. Russell Batoon was a real person, but he was a Marine stationed in North Carolina, and no connection between him and the unidentified couple using his name could be made. Without any of her belongings, authorities had no clues to follow to try to identify the young woman. Unable to determine her identity or locate her family, the citizens of Pecos collected money to pay for a funeral and proper burial for her. She was buried in Fairview Cemetery, her grave marker simply reading "Unknown Girl Drowned July 5, 1966. Local citizens and law enforcement officials working on her case have continued to bring flowers. The Pecos Police Department's commitment to identifying their Jane Doe did not diminish over the years, and eventually they began searching for new resources in their effort. On August 27, 2019, Jane Doe's remains were exhumed so that new forensic techniques could be utilized in her identification. Authorities worked with the University of North Texas, such as for human identification, to record her information in NamUs and perform initial DNA testing. In 2019, police also partnered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who released a new artistic rendering of what the young woman looked like when she was alive. They hoped that someone would recognize the young woman in the image after it was disseminated to the public through the media. The image was created using Polaroids of the young woman's body that had been found in the archives of the funeral home that had handled her funeral. In August of 2020, the young woman's remains were taken to Othram, a private DNA lab in the Woodlands, Texas. They extracted DNA from one of the bones and developed a DNA profile. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children then began coordinating an effort to try to identify the young woman using genetic genealogy. Innovative Forensic, a genetic genealogy firm based in Virginia, donated their service to the investigation. After uploading the DNA profile to Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, they were eventually able to find potential distant relatives of Jane Doe. Authorities then visited someone they believed to be a close relative of Jane Doe based on this information, who provided them with a DNA sample. Comparing their DNA to that of the unidentified young woman who had drowned in Texas more than 5 decades earlier, they were finally able to identify her. On January 19, 2021, Pecos Police Department Police Chief Lisa Tarango held a press conference and announced that the young woman had been identified as Jolene Hem. Authorities had visited one of her sisters in Kansas the week before to inform her of the identification. Jolene was one of 15 children and grew up outside of Salina, Kansas. "We had wonderful parents and lived on a little farm just east of town. Not extremely rich people, but we were rich with our family," according to her brother Paul. She was 17 years old and working at a drive-in diner when she abruptly disappeared in early July 1966 without even collecting her most recent paycheck. According to the Hem family, a young man had been paying extra attention to Jolene just prior to her disappearance, but they did not know his identity or have any evidence that she had left town with him. Jolene's family worked extensively with law enforcement trying to find her, but never located her. 5 of Jolene's siblings, as well as both of her parents, died without knowing what became of her. Her mother never gave up hope that Jolene was still alive and spent every Mother's Day waiting for Jolene to call her. Jolene's remains are going to be sent to Kansas so that she can be laid to rest next to her parents. While the mystery of the identity of the Pecos Jane Doe has finally been solved, the investigation into her death is still open and active. While she may have drowned accidentally, circumstances like the reported screams and the suspicious behavior of the man traveling with her have led to police continuing to investigate the manner of her death. Police have been unable to locate Jolene's autopsy file, which could contain important information about any injuries she may have sustained. They particularly hope to be able to identify and speak with the man who was traveling with Jolene so they can learn more about the circumstances that brought her to Texas and surrounding her death. Fort Worth, Texas, a bustling city in the northeast of the state, is rich in history and offers plenty of things to see and do. With nearly 1 million residents, one of them was 28-year-old Elizabeth Poole Ariano, who was born on August 16, 1987, in Fort Worth. She came from a large, loving family. Elizabeth was incredibly close to her two sisters, Johanna and Alejandra. Despite her parents' separation, she maintained a strong bond with her mother, Juanita, and her stepfather, Fidel, who considered her as his own. Fidel later shared that they had mutual respect for each other, and their relationship was as close as any father and daughter could be. Family meant everything to Elizabeth. She always put others' needs ahead of her own and was ready to help anyone in need. While attending Diamond Hill Jarvis High School, Elizabeth met Rodolfo Ariano, also known as Rudy, and they began a relationship. They later married and had 4 children together, 3 sons and a daughter, whom Elizabeth was fully devoted to. She was determined to raise them to be respectful and kind, values she consistently demonstrated. A deeply committed Christian, Elizabeth attended church regularly. Her kind and giving personality was reflected in her job as a medical assistant, a profession she took great pride in and had done for several years. Her life was busy, with 4 beautiful children and a great career. It seemed to be going well for her. However, her marriage to Rudy would later start to fall apart due to his controlling behavior. By April of 2016, and after 13 years together, Elizabeth had decided to file for divorce. She had moved out of the family home and gone back to her parents' house, taking her children with her. She was ready to begin a new chapter and take on any challenges that were coming her way. This was not an easy decision for her to make, but she knew it was the right one. April 15, 2016. In spite of everything going on with her marriage, Elizabeth appeared to be happy and doing well during the day. That evening, she had gone out with some of her girlfriends from work to a local place for happy hour, giving her the chance to unwind and have some fun. After enjoying the night out, she headed back to her parents' house in the early morning hours of April 16th. After she pulled up outside, she contacted one of her colleagues she had been out with and told them that she was back home safe. As morning broke on April 16th, Elizabeth's mother, Juanita, would make a worrying discovery. Elizabeth was not in the house. Despite looking everywhere for her, she was nowhere to be found. As Juanita went outside, she found Elizabeth's car seemingly abandoned. It contained several personal items that one would expect someone to take with them if they were to go anywhere, including her purse and phone, which was still on the passenger seat. The key was still in the ignition. This was completely out of character for Elizabeth. There was no way she would disappear and not tell anyone where she was going or what her intentions were. She also would never leave her children. She had seemingly pulled up outside the house and then vanished. Her mother knew something was seriously wrong, so reported her daughter as missing. As police arrived on scene, a missing persons investigation was launched. They needed to establish the timeline of events leading up to her going missing. So they spoke to those who knew her, one of which was her estranged husband, Rudy. The officers headed over to his house to talk to him. He said that he had last heard from her at 2:39 on the morning she was last seen, after she had come back from her night out. According to him, she said that she had arrived home and would be bringing the children to his place as soon as possible. He said that she explained she was going to spend the night in a hotel once she had dropped the children off at his house. When she failed to turn up, he told the officers that he assumed she had decided against bringing them and instead chose to remain where she was. The police needed to know what his movements had been that day in order to rule him out. He said he had spent the day with one of his friends and that he had got home at around midnight, saying he had stayed in his house until 7:30 a.m. As the search for the missing mother continued, a phone call to 911 from just a few hours before at 3:30 a.m. would blow the case wide open. The call had come in from someone doing some nighttime fishing on Lake Worth. The drop from the Interstate 820 bridge into the water was 40 feet. One witness said they heard what appeared to be screams on the way down. After the call had come in, officers had been immediately dispatched, and working with the fire department and divers, they entered into the water to see if they could find anything. And tragically, they did. The body of a woman was found and pulled from the water. She was still wearing her maroon scrubs from work. It was Elizabeth Ariano. When her body had been retrieved from the water, they found that a 119-pound rock had been tied around her neck. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner ruled her death as a homicide, the result of drowning, and the concrete rock weighing her down. The weight had been tied around her neck to ensure that her body did not come up to the surface. The police said, "We believe this was an attempt to conceal the body." Horrifyingly, she had been alive when she had gone into the water. Elizabeth Ariano had been murdered. Her life had been ended in a way so brutal it shocked even the most tenured of officers. The police were now in a race against time to find whoever was responsible. They were clearly capable of unimaginable cruelty, and they needed to be stopped. They had many theories they had to consider. Had she been followed home by someone from the bar? Had an opportunist abducted and killed her after seeing her arrive home? Had this been someone lying in wait? One of the first things the police needed to do was establish who was where at the time of her murder and rule out as many people as possible. Rudy was adamant that he was at home at the time and that he had nothing to do with it. As news began to spread about what had happened, people in the community were in disbelief, stunned that something so brutal could happen. A neighbor told CBS 11, "How can somebody do something like that? I don't understand how people can be so evil and so mean to another human being." A GoFundMe was set up to help cover the costs of her funeral, and before long, it had raised more than $11,000. Rudy posted this to his Facebook page and various flyers to benefits in memory of Elizabeth. Before long, her family and friends gathered for her funeral. Johanna had purchased a turtleneck for Elizabeth to wear, disguising the rope marks around her neck. Devastated, she stood next to Rudy by her sister's coffin. Although Rudy appeared to be a heartbroken widower, his behavior did not come across that way to investigators. When they had spoken to him, he didn't seem worried. He didn't seem concerned. Even though their marriage appeared to be over, she was still someone he had spent his life with, and she was the mother of his children. So his apparent lack of concern was strange. As the police continued to investigate Elizabeth's murder, they began to examine the CCTV footage from around the area, and this would give them their first solid lead. At 3:02 a.m. on the morning she went missing, a white pickup truck was seen driving away from where her parents had lived. Rudy owned a white pickup truck. An affidavit would later say, this direction of travel would be the most direct path from the last place Elizabeth's vehicle was seen on camera, and where she was found. In spite of his insistence that he had been at home that night, mobile phone data and mapping would also blow huge holes in his alibi. When looking into his phone records, it showed that his phone had pinged close to the house Elizabeth's parents had lived in on the morning she had disappeared. As the investigations continued, police discovered that when Elizabeth had gone out with her friends on the evening of 15th, Rudy had made several attempts to contact her. He had sent her a message asking her when she would be clocking off from work, and records showed that he had been in the vicinity of her workplace when he had tried to get hold of her. He had also tried to call her, but she hadn't answered. Phone analysis showed he had moved from her place of work to her parents' home, knowing that's where she was staying. The picture that was being painted was a disturbing one, but detectives needed to continue to build their case against him and find more evidence that contradicted what he had told them and linked him to what had happened to Elizabeth. In order to do this, a search warrant was issued for his house. According to an affidavit, the police showed the rope that had been used to attach the concrete to Elizabeth's body to her oldest son. It was rope that he recognized. He recalled that he had been playing with the same rope in the back garden, and he had noticed when it had disappeared. They also showed him a picture of the concrete. He recognized this too. It looked just like some concrete that had been in the garden after his father had replaced a fence for one of his friends. The fence posts had been encased in concrete. The same concrete was also found in his truck. With the evidence piling up, investigators believed that she had arrived home from her night out, and he had ambushed her before she was able to get inside and proceeded to kidnap her. He had then taken her to the Interstate 20 bridge that ran over Lake Worth and threw her off it with the rock tied to her neck. 10 days after his wife's body was pulled from the water, Rudy Ariano was arrested on suspicion of her murder. He was then charged and held at Mansfield City Jail on a $500,000 bond. A witness also spoke to the local media who observed his behavior the day after his wife's death, as her devastated family tried to come to terms with what had happened to her and come to terms with who was responsible. They spoke to the media about Elizabeth and how much she meant to them. Rudy Ariano continued to deny any involvement, but he was soon forced to make a decision. If he entered a plea of not guilty, and if he were convicted by a jury at trial, then he would face the death penalty. With this in mind, he took a plea deal her family had agreed to. And on Wednesday, January 30th, 2019, Rudy Ariano entered a plea of guilty to the kidnapping and murder of his wife Elizabeth, thus taking the death penalty off the table. Ariano's coldness was shocking. Just 2 hours after he had brutally murdered the mother of his children, he had posted a meme to Facebook that said, "How long can one go without drinking before they die?" And he commented, "I'm already worried." He had pretended to be the devastated husband crying by his wife's coffin. He had lied to the people that had loved and cared for him, people that he had known for years. He offered no explanation. He offered no apology. Rudy Ariano was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His defense lawyer said that the plea deal was the correct resolution. Elizabeth's family said they took comfort in knowing he would never, ever be released. Johanna, Elizabeth's sister, gave an emotional victim impact statement. She also recalled standing next to him at Elizabeth's funeral. She said, "You knew what you did, yet you stood in front of her body crying with me. You told me the day of her burial that you wished it was you in there, and how you just wanted to lay there with her. That when you married her, you knew it would be until death do you part, but didn't know that it would happen so soon. You're a coward." Elizabeth's stepfather, Fidel, also spoke about her children. Outside the courtroom, Elizabeth's family spoke to the media. Elizabeth Poole Ariano was a devoted mother and much-loved daughter, sister, aunt, friend, and colleague. She had an enormous impact on those she knew and those she helped to care for. Her sister Johanna said that her family will continue to keep her memory alive and talk about her with her children. For those who knew and loved her, they will never forget what a kind, thoughtful, and amazing woman she was. Jordan Naterer graduated from Memorial University of Newfoundland with a degree in engineering and went on to earn his master's degree at the University of British Columbia. After completing his studies, he stayed in British Columbia, living in an apartment on Seymour Street in Vancouver, and worked as an engineer. His sister, Julia, described him as the best person you will ever meet, with the spirit of an old man and the heart of a child. On October 9, 2020, Julia FaceTimed her brother while she was at home in St. John's, Newfoundland. During the call, Jordan proudly showed her all the equipment he had purchased for his first overnight hike, which he planned to start the next day. He had prepared for the cold weather he would encounter overnight in Banning Provincial Park, including a winter-rated sleeping bag, a sleeping mat, and a down-filled coat. The next morning, Saturday, October 10th, Jordan left his apartment shortly after 7 a.m. and drove about 125 miles east to Banning Provincial Park. Credit card records would later reveal that he bought a coffee at the park's resort. At 10:18, he purchased a park permit at the front desk of the resort, logging his emergency contact information as well as the color of his tent, orange, with the park when he informed them that he would be staying there overnight. The following Monday, October 12th, was Thanksgiving in Canada, and Jordan had plans to have dinner with some of his friends back in Vancouver. He never arrived and did not call or text his friends to let him know he was not coming, which was highly out of character for him. Jordan's black Honda Civic was located near the Frosty Mountain Trailhead at the Lightning Lake Day use area, indicating that he had never returned from his hike, and the search for him in the park began. Search and rescue teams from several agencies were all involved with the search. They focused the search area based on a statement from another hiker who came forward reporting that he had seen Jordan around 4 p.m. on October 10th, 30 to 45 minutes away from the Frosty Mountain Trailhead. The Frosty Mountain Trail was the trail it is believed Jordan was planning on hiking. Despite the extensive effort, Jordan was not found, and the search was suspended on October 17th, with authorities claiming they had exhausted all avenues of investigation and needed new clues to follow in order to continue with the search effort. Cases such as Mr. Naterer's are very rare. It's always our goal to locate missing persons as soon as possible, and their files are never closed. Our investigators will continue to investigate any additional information that becomes available, but at this time, we have followed up on all leads. Vancouver Police Department Constable Tanya Vicenten wrote in an email to CBC News after the search was called off. Jordan's family was upset by this decision and continued looking for him on their own. Jordan's parents, Josie and Greg, had flown to British Columbia from Newfoundland to aid in the search effort. Once the official search was called off, they had to figure out how to keep the effort going on their own. They set up a GoFundMe to raise funds for a private search, which costs $1,000 a day to perform. A large early donation to the effort came from Jordan's employer, and members of the community also began donating to the effort. Helicopters were hired, as was a drone company, which flew over areas of interest in the park taking footage. The images the drones captured were then meticulously inspected by a network of volunteers looking for any signs of Jordan or his belongings. The Naterer family did believe the official search should also continue. The day after it was called off, a bag with a hat and sunglasses believed to belong to Jordan was discovered by another hiker, and the Naterers argued that these items constituted new clues that needed to be followed up on by the authorities. The official search had covered an area to the lower right side of the trail, but based on the location where the items were found, the search should have been more towards the left of the trail. Pieces of synthetic down filler, consistent with the type found in Jordan's apartment, which he used in craft projects, was also found in the park outside of the area that had been officially searched. This led to speculation that Jordan perhaps was injured and throwing away small items in hopes that they will be taken down the trail and lead people to him. When Jordan's family was finally able to access his cell phone records, they further supported the notion that the official search had been in the wrong area. Jordan's cell phone pinged at 12:30 on the afternoon of October 10th, roughly 2.5 miles southeast of the Manning Resort on the Windy Joe mountainside of the trail loop. Jordan's family believes that he may have hiked the trail in reverse in order to get to two trails near the bottom of Windy Joe Mountain that would get him to the campground where he will be spending the night earlier. It had started snowing around 3 p.m. on October 10th. And if Jordan had learned of the forecast before he started his hike, it would make sense for him to want to reach the campground and stop moving for the day earlier than planned. The terrain off of those trails is very steep and rugged. If Jordan became disoriented and went off trail, he could have been injured trying to traverse the terrain. Jordan's family believed that in this scenario, Jordan would have tried to maneuver himself to be near a source of water if possible, but then would have stayed there, relying on his equipment to keep him warm until someone came and found him. The official search did briefly resume, but was called off again due to poor weather. The private ground search continued until November 7th, when the weather deteriorated to the point where it was no longer possible to continue. Greg and Josie Naterer made the difficult decision to leave British Columbia without finding Jordan, stating that it was important for them to be with their two daughters. Their efforts to find Jordan have continued even though they are no longer in the area, with new aerial searches and review of their footage continuing even after they returned home. Greg and Josie have expressed their immense gratitude to the numerous individuals who have donated their time and money to the search effort, and to everyone who has supported them through this difficult time for their family. "We're just overwhelmed by how many people out there care about our well-being," Greg told the Telegram, a daily newspaper in St. John's. "For that, we are profoundly grateful." On July 23, 2018, at 9 p.m., a 000 call came in from a 19-year-old at a house in Sunbury, Melbourne, Victoria. Senior Constable Luke Kalkian, who was on shift at the Sunbury police station at the time, instantly recognized the voice on the other end of the phone. The caller said, "I think I killed someone. I didn't want to, but I did it. He came. He didn't seem scared. I strangled him. He's on my bed. Feels so good. I don't want to be a killer. Have you actually done that?" he asked. "You never believe me. Why don't you believe me?" they bluntly and calmly replied. Authorities were dispatched immediately, and when they got to the home, it turned out that Constable Kalkian had been right about the voice. He had recognized it. The caller answered the door, and it was someone the station knew all too well, Jamie Lee Dollar Guy. As they entered the home, they found 25-year-old Morlin Rod in the bedroom. A cord attached to a sex toy was wrapped around his neck, and he was lying motionless. "See, I wasn't lying, you never believed me. Why won't you ever believe me? He's dead, isn't he?" Jamie shouted at the officers. Morlin was put into an ambulance and rushed off to hospital, and Jamie was taken down to the station for questioning. Given what she had revealed already, she was charged with attempted murder, intentionally causing serious injury, and recklessly causing serious injury. What had happened and how it came to be was a frightening story. In the early evening of July 23, 2018, 19-year-old Jamie Lee Guy logged on to the popular dating app used by millions worldwide, Plenty of Fish. Her bio read borderline personality disorder and suicidal tendencies into extreme fetishes, vampire fantasies, bondage, biting people, and being gang raped against her will. She wasn't on it long. Before around 7 p.m., she got a message from a 25-year-old student, Morlin Rod. They exchanged a total of 6 messages, sexual in nature, and about everything in Jamie's profile. He told her, "We'll do whatever you want." They made a plan to meet up at her house, with Jamie saying she would put on a costume and her favorite perfume. Morlin told her he would be there just after 8 p.m., and he would text when he was outside. With this, he closed the app and started getting ready. 4 years before this, Morlin Rod had made the big move from Gujarat in Western India to Australia on a student visa to get his master's in accounting. He had really started a whole new life and had settled him well at Charles Sturt University, also working part-time as a delivery driver. He was an only child and was very close to his parents, talking to them every day. They had even sold their bungalow to finance his move to Australia when they realized it was his dream. As soon as they had the money, Morlin was on his way, and the family took some photos at the airport before he left. Friends described him as happy-go-lucky, easygoing, but hardworking and very humble. His hard work had almost paid off, and was proud to say he was just 4 months away from finishing his course. His professors believed in him so much, they had actually offered him a job when he finished so he could stay in Australia permanently. Jamie was now at the station and talking a lot. She started by telling the detectives she had been having a bad day, and the second Morlin agreed to meet her, she knew she was going to kill him. A matter of minutes after she ended her conversation with him on Plenty of Fish, she started making some Google searches. "I'm going to kill someone tonight for fun. How to kill someone. I want to commit murder. I'm going to kill someone tonight. Help." She then clicked on a link called 10 Steps for Committing a Murder and Get Away with It. At 8 o'clock and 7 seconds p.m., Morlin arrived at the house. She told detectives she immediately took note of his shape and size and felt he was weak enough that strangulation would be easy. She told him she wanted to role play, and he was keen to learn. "I told him that I wouldn't let him out of the house, and he said he didn't care. I said that I'm going to choke play, and he said he's happy to learn anything. So I said that I have psychopathic tendencies in my head, and I'm not really that safe. And he said he's not scared," she said. Morlin said as long as she didn't hurt him, he was up for anything. Jamie told him he could just tap, and she would stop. He seemed to be thinking it's all a game, she told the officers. She got behind him and started choking him. Jamie said she had 2 personalities. "One's mean, one's nice. They're both me. One is caring and the other is destructive. I was hoping he would run away, call the police," she said. Just a few seconds later, he started to panic and tapped her. But instead of stopping as she'd promised, she only squeezed harder, wrapping her legs around his body to get a tighter grip. She whispered in his ear, "It'll be okay. It'll all be over." At this point, after attempting to wriggle out of her grip for several seconds, Morlin was now lying on his stomach and Jamie was sat on his back. He suddenly went limp, and Jamie said she then tied the cord from the sex toy around his neck. "What was your intention?" the officer asked. "Murder," she replied. Just before calling the police, Jamie made some more searches online, looking for ways to be admitted into hospital. She told them she had had an urge to kill, comparing it to the feeling of someone who wants to smoke a cigarette. As she was talking more and more, the story was getting more disturbing as it went on. And the police then got a call. Morlin hadn't pulled through and had succumbed to his injuries just a few hours after getting to the hospital. After this, Jamie Guy's charges would swiftly be upgraded to murder. What she had done, although shocking, was not actually surprising to those that knew her. Some carers who had worked with her even described her as a shape-shifting demon girl. Jamie had lived in state care since she was 10 years old, with frequent visits from social workers and her criminal record starting when she was young. She often spent long periods in juvenile detention. In the years before she turned 18, Jamie had carers living with her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a house owned by the Department of Health and Human Services. They said they were terrified of her and her unpredictability. But when she turned 18, however, they all stepped away, and she was living alone and unsupervised. As soon as they left, neighbors said the police were there for a lot of various reasons, including noise disturbances, fighting, and welfare checks. She would often bring them cakes and cards after their visits to thank them, and they had grown to know her fairly well. She was a massive social media user and would upload numerous times a day. Sometimes the pictures were simply her playing around with filters and sharing her artwork. And sometimes they were lengthy paragraphs about her childhood trauma, sexual abuse, and the issues she had with her body. She said she hated skinny, pretty girls and wanted to torture them. She would self-harm and put batteries into her body, resulting in her having more than 100 operations to remove foreign bodies. One of her friends said she claimed to have a demon inside her, and sometimes believed that she was a wolf. One moment she appeared happy and was smiling, the next she was going ballistic, snarling and growling like a wolf and biting people. It is one of the scariest things I have ever seen. It's like she was possessed, someone said. She posted to Facebook just a few weeks before the murder of Morlin and said, "If only they believed me when I said I'm not sane. I live in fear, afraid of what's behind the corner. My heart is black. I no longer feel the emotions of happiness unless I see someone else suffer." And on the afternoon she did kill him, she texted one of her carers and said, "I feel really sick with bad temptations. I want to call the police, but they won't believe me. I want to cry." Upon being charged with murder, everybody knew that it would be a complicated case. As a result, she was assessed by some of the best clinical minds in Australia, and they said she was one of the most psychologically damaged they'd ever assessed. There is no doubt that Jamie Dollar Guy was a profoundly troubled person, and everybody said she was a ticking time bomb. Despite all of her confessions and admissions, in her first court appearance, she entered a plea of not guilty. As prosecutors dived further into the case, Morlin's friends in Australia banded together to raise money to send him back to India to be with his family. It took him 12 days to get home, where he was cremated. A year would then pass as more interviews, assessments, and the like were carried out, establishing whether or not Jamie was fit to stand trial. It was deemed that she was, and the now 20-year-old's murder trial would begin at the end of 2019. Morlin's parents said although they wanted to be there for their son, they simply couldn't afford to fly over, so they had to wait by the phone every day for any update. The loss had left them unable to eat or sleep, and not being able to get to Australia had only added to their pain. In terms of Jamie's mental health and past issues, it was set to be a complex trial. There was no denying that she had killed Morlin. She had already confessed to that. But it was now an argument of whether her mental health issues affected her in that moment, and whether or not the murderous intent could be proven. As a result, her lawyers were pushing for a conviction of manslaughter. Her defense team called in a psychologist, Dr. Carroll, and he told the jury that he did not believe that Jamie suffered from psychosis in any way. He said that she knew what she had done was wrong, and that she was aware of what she was doing. He said she was in a state of turmoil, but had a residual awareness that choking Morlin would actually kill him. Jamie's lawyer, Sharon Lacey, focused heavily on her childhood. She spoke about her past abuse, living in care, and suicidal thoughts and tendencies. They said that her borderline personality disorder had played a role, and Jamie was suffering from stunted psychological development brought on by the trauma of her childhood. Jamie sat quietly in the courtroom the whole time, not looking up and not paying attention. Sometimes smiling, but mainly focusing her attention on the children's coloring books she was drawing in and making origami. Sharon said her client was so damaged that no jury could be sure of her having murderous intent, and therefore they could not find her guilty of murder. "There's no evidence to suggest she intended to hurt him," she said. But the prosecution said that while it was clear there was some significant trauma in her life, as well as severe mental health issues, she admitted to the police that she knew before he even arrived at the house that she was going to kill him. As soon as she got that first text, she had in mind to harm this man, they said. And when Morley got to the house, Jamie admitted to sizing him up, assessing how easy it would be to kill him. And her own description of how it all played out showed that Jamie was someone who wanted to do this. Someone who was very much present in the moment and understood exactly what the implications were. It was absolutely premeditated, they said. After an 18-day trial, when numerous witnesses, including Jamie's carers and clinical experts, and the tape of her lengthy police interview was shown, it was now up to the jury to make the final call. Jamie Guy was acquitted of murder and instead found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. Safe to say this decision left a lot of people shocked and bewildered. Some sources say that if everything about her dark past and violent tendencies had been told to the jury, maybe the outcome would have been different. But it is hard to tell. The carers that spent even a short period with her argued she should never be released and is far too dangerous. The judge said to Jamie, "You took the life of a young person who had done nothing to harm or provoke you. He was totally trusting and unsuspecting. And although manslaughter carries a maximum of 20 years in Victoria, Jamie Lee Guy was sentenced to 9 years in prison, with a minimum term of 5 years 6 months. But she had already served just over 2 years, so she could actually be out in just over 3 years. In the court's paperwork, it said that an attribute of her personality was a limited capacity for empathy and capacity to feel remorse. Remorse may serve as an indicator of the likelihood of a person reoffending. A person who is truly and deeply remorseful for their actions is less likely to repeat them. In your case, due to your empathy deficits, I am not convinced that the amount of remorse you feel is likely to significantly inhibit future conduct. Nevertheless, I accept that you do feel remorse to the extent that you are able to. It follows that you must be given the benefit of remorse in mitigation of your sentence. Morlin's parents were horrified. The people were aware she was so high risk, and even the social workers were scared of being on their own with her, and yet she was still allowed to live alone, with people coming and going as they pleased. And to top it all off, she could be back out in just a few years. It is hard to know what will happen after these few years in prisoner up for Jamie Guy, and how this situation will be approached and handled. This was an unsettling, disturbing, and very upsetting case to look into in many ways, and we're interested to hear your thoughts about it. One thing we know for sure is that Morlin Rod lost his life in a terrifying way with someone he had put trust into, and his last few moments realizing what was actually happening to him is unthinkable. His father said, "We are now lonely in our old age. We miss him, but we've accepted the truth. Our son won't come back, but he will remain in our memory and our hearts forever." Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.